This session is Mark Lizar, who's CEO and co-founder of Zero Public Network, which is a great name. If you're into zero knowledge proofs and protocols, that's a kind of hint there, maybe. I'm not sure. There's also a background in digital ID, vice chair of the IEEE Cybersecurity Next Generation, which is interesting, and also an organization that gives input into ISO IEC standards, 27560, chair of and controller of controller credential specification, trust over IP, if you're interested in another technology which has been kicking around in internet standards. So there's a bunch of these different standards organizations, which is the hint I'm getting there, and lots of activity there. So over to you, please. There's a microphone, so walking around with that mic.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here. Came all the way from Canada, so thanks for the lift on the way here. And it's great to come and talk about this topic. Let me see if this works. Oh, so that's huh? So that's backwards. All right. There we go. Okay. So this is a bit of an old presentation, so I drafted it, but I haven't been able to update it. So I might not stick to it, and there's some content and there's spelling and stuff. So I'm going to run with it, but I just thought I'd warn you a little bit. So my background is really in sociology and law, and then I went off into digital identity management, and wondered how this technical term identity, it was really so technical, it doesn't really represent what I understood in sociology or in society as identity. So there's a big difference between what's called identity and what we understand ourselves to be, our being as an identity. So I've always been trying to, bridge the gap between those understandings. So, really there's a great semantic battle, I think, going on around digital identity and security and transparency, which makes it really difficult to work on trustworthy identity. So I just had to get that out first so I can jump in. Digital identity, has a great potential to solve the largest challenges we have on the planet, from climate change to security, and to distribution of wealth and a lot of other things. But we need to definitely work on some of the challenges around digital identity itself as a technology. So I've actually been focusing on trustworthy identity for 15 years. I tried to open a community interest company in 2007 in the UK called Identity Trust. And then I was told that you couldn't because the word trust was in the word of the name of the company. So that was really interesting. Anyways, let me get on with this. So the problem, so after boiling the ocean a few times, what's really, stark is that people don't control their own digital identity relationship records. So if you imagine a cookie, which is much like a receipt, but a cookie is really, it's a baked good. So it's a deceptive name to begin with. Tasty treat for people, maybe. But like cookies, they're managed, those are records that are managed by other companies, by service providers, and they're not managed by the individual. So without a record of our own, we're not included. So fundamentally, in order to include or make digital identity inclusive, people need to have their own records that they can validate themselves so they can trust. So they're not able to trust digital identity systems if we're not able to see who we're dealing with, how many times we've dealt with them, who's in control of your data, basically. So data control is remarkably absent from discourse. And there's been a lack of standardization around semantics and data control. So I've spent a lot of time working on something called a consent receipt, which is how I've learned a lot about data control. And the consent receipt out of the Cantera initiative, which is an identity management community, was adopted in 2015 or 2017 by ISO, IEC. So it's now going through the process. And the idea is to be able to give a person a record of when they consented so they can track and see how their data is being processed. But most importantly, from session to session, has my privacy changed? So I think the critical thing we've been working on is that type of transparency and signaling that is operational and reciprocal to the technology. So right now we have terms and services that people don't read. Those are actually contracts. They're not. So any privacy policy associated with terms of service is a privacy policy for a contract. So it's not actually privacy. It's not privacy law. So that's the big hack. I think that's the dark pattern that causes the most problems. And the one that's enabled contract-based governance to dominate services online. So there's a native security flaw to digital identity technology. And that is that you have to provide your secret raw personal data in order to get access to a system. So you're being tracked and analyzed and surveilled prior to consent or prior to a permission and without any transparency. So without that type of transparency, how could you possibly trust any digital identity system? So I've just recently completed a paper in Canada which compared PIPEDA, which is the Canadian privacy law, against the GDPR for adequacy, and against DIAC's digital identity framework, which is the Canadian Digital Identity Association, it's called the PCTF. And we found that the defaults for transparency are much different per country and per framework. So if we don't have a consistent understanding of transparency over digital identity, how can we possibly, again, trust the use of it? Because you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between good and bad. So, I mean, fundamental transparency issues, but fundamental is the surveillance without my authority. So even though it's a security technology that I wouldn't go so far as saying digital trust, but digital assurance can be used to provide enterprise systems with assurance of who's logging in and to control access to databases and files. It's just really the other side of the assurance, the personal assurance, where we can see who's processing our data, is largely missing and not standardized at this time. So the cause, I think, is a very old code is law, Lawrence Lessig, one of the early heroes in the research. So this year there was a privacy day at CINO, and I should have put the researcher's name in on this. I will do that in a follow-up, but it showed that on the Android platform, 73.1% of the applications disclose data with third parties without any transparency or any notice. So less than 10% had any type of notice of consent. And of those, only 3.5 actually obeyed the consent withdrawal signal and still gave access. So that's how much, that's how much code is the law rather than law is the code. And what we see online is these SDKs have default text, default policies. They're just copied by developers, put in with little understanding. And this data is shared out the back door on all our devices, which are leaking our data constantly. So this is a massive, security breach and a really huge issue, because now we're seeing big data being used to attack systems and little control for anybody to actually protect themselves in context of using a service. So this is really what we're looks at right now. So this is typically using a website. There's a record that's made that's called metadata in it with identifiers, but really that's our personal microdata. It's not, I wouldn't call it metadata. I think that's very deceptive. And that record's held, via a contract, which is the governance tool in a database, the company data store, for example. And then that's shared with a third party, which really isn't a third party. It's a sub-processor, which is Google Analytics and cookies, under some contract with unknown people, and there's a real-time bidding war for your attention of advertising. So are people familiar with this? Because I think it's pretty common now. Cool, understanding. So this is how, really, that record, that metadata, is a receipt. It's the equivalent of a receipt. And I'm not sure if people know this, but a receipt is, assumed to be the first ever writing that humans have done. So they were sending some goods down a waterway. Obviously, someone kept eating them. So one day somebody wrote on a tablet, here's 5 bundles of whatever it was, bananas, so that when it got there, someone could read it and go, there's supposed to be 5 bundles of bananas. So it was how to track something that was invisible to the person. And it's said to be the first ever script. And the reason why we actually started writing was so that we can track goods invisibly. So this is like perhaps the oldest technology that we use or have. And I would say that all of these records and receipts, verified credentials and SSI, they're just derivatives of a record and a receipt. Infamously, I think they used to send a lot of gold around between Italy and France, and a receipt was evolved from a bank, gave them a note, went to the next bank and took out the gold instead of carrying the gold, around the country where it was constantly being robbed. So that's the scenario we're in now, where we don't control or see who's controlling our data. So, it's pretty obvious. Click a tick box to something you haven't read that you're agreeing to say that you understand. Obviously this governance framework is faulty, and it should have moved on quite a long time ago. In fact, the person I first started working with in 2012 on this, Renee Lloyd, she's now counsel at General Electric. She wrote one of the first terms and conditions policies for Amazon, and she was a big advocate for this work. So she's been really supportive, but obviously children can't agree to contracts. It's not safe. 1/3 of internet users are children, and this is obviously not safe for them. And what people really don't know, even in a contract, you still have privacy rights. So privacy rights supersede contracts. But there's more lawyers in Washington than there are in like China, I think, or something like. So, it's very difficult. You're fighting an army of lawyers making bespoke contracts. But on the previous slide, I have this little box here. So they can give you personalized advertising per second, but you can't have a personalized privacy policy. So one size fits all. So there's remarkable gaps in the framework that is really sophisticated. So the solution, did I get the solution side? Yeah. So sort of out of order, these slides, but what we recommend, or what we start looking at, is starting with a data control impact assessment. So what we want to know is who controls the data. Is it me or is it someone else? Is that controller a delegated controller or a sub-processor? So in data protection law, or data privacy, the third party is usually an authorized third party. So it's someone who's known. There's really not a concept of an unauthorized third party. That's just called data breach. So it's, so your data is either being breached or you've been authorized, like for the police to do an investigation or that sort of thing. So what is the sensitivity of the data? But I think what's most important is it's not sharing, it's called disclosure. So when your data is disclosed by another party, you're not sharing it, right? And what's really important is that you need to know who that's shared with. So each disclosure point is a new privacy impact assessment or data control impact assessment. So, that's a critical issue for cybersecurity. So I think the main point really is data protection by itself is only one vector of governance. And there's a couple of vectors that are missing. Data protection law was written prior to the internet. It's pretty analog. After looking at the mobile phone research, I would even say it's data breach law without these other vectors included. So these other two vectors is personal data control. So if we control our data and we don't share it, then it's a lot less risk. But when we do use our data, there's a much higher sort of liability for us as a person because we can't get away from it. So one of the reasons why these little tick boxes work is because we're not really liable. I just agreed to something I don't understand. There's no way they can hold me against it. I don't even know what I did. So that's one of the issues. So in co-regulated space, so co-regulation is really maybe one of the main purposes of government, which is really like schools and school boards and churches and those sort of community stakeholders that come together and manage people's data at a community level. And it's lower risk for people because people are present. So we can protect ourselves, or we can engage ourselves, or we can have advocates. But when we get to data protection, it's separate. So our data is being extracted perhaps to a different country and aggregated for profit, and then reused on us without our knowledge, is really the sort of data protection model that we know of today, where we don't see the risks and we're not really liable for them. So, yeah. So this slide, if you can imagine, I redid this slide. There's only 4 boxes that are supposed to be in here. So there's 1, yellow, orange, and red. And really it shows that you can mitigate these privacy and security risks by enabling people to have control of their data. So you can transfer it back and forth for dynamic data controls. So you give people a standardized notice in a context they understand and expect, then people can choose to withdraw consent, or they can restrict processing. So those sort of things mitigate risk, especially if people control the data source. If people don't control the data source, then you have to, how much trust do you actually have to provide to the organization or the company to assume that they're not sharing it? Well, you don't actually have to provide any trust. It could all be transparent, under control, and governed with codes of conduct and codes of practice, which is one of the amazing things that have been coming out of the ICO's office, is the code of practice work. So that the data control and governance models can be extended. So we have 4 tiers. I'm missing the 3rd tier there, unfortunately, on the other slide. But in tier 1, controllers, they self-assert their digital identity. So this is really about data controllers on the bottom. But if you control your own data source and you're like in person, then that's really low risk. So it doesn't really matter, if they are verified or validated. But the idea really here is to flip around the understanding of, so we're really focusing on the surveillance or transparency and tracking of data controllers and their services. So when you get to co-regulation, tier 2, what we have is a standardized controller credential that's regulated by law. And that's bound to the accountable person, which is by default would be the director of the company, or the someone who owns the company, and that makes the controller credential. So they're sort of the holder, but they can delegate that credential to other people in their organization. So I noticed a lot of our research, started with the ICO's data controller registry, and in that registry, we know most of the accountable people are actually third-party law firms or some other management security organization without a controller ID. So they're not, so you can't see who their controller is. So there was a gap in, same sort of gap in the third-party use of that data. Anyways, number 3 is active state transparency. So with records and receipts, I can make a record every time I enter a service or a new session, and I can see if there's any changes. Anyways, time's flown. So there is an architecture where consent is law. And I'm really happy to announce that we finally, after like a few years, have written up something called an operational transparency specification for notice records and receipts. And we're pushing that forward to ISO. I'm actually going there later this week. And in that, the idea is that we can make a controller credential from any company or service provider independently of them. So we can basically don't need the infrastructure of services provide. We need public infrastructure standards can provide. And we advocate non-national standards for international scalability or internet scalability. So this is a bit on the terms and definitions. I definitely go for human-centric terms. So we're constantly battling for those. But a really key thing I try to fit in before time's up is the delivery method, the implementation, is what we call a two-factor notice, which we like to see coinciding with two-factor authentication, where you get a notice with purpose and risk, and you get 3 options with consent, no consent, or rights. So you can actually access your rights immediately. And when you engage with this notice, it makes a record and a receipt. And the individual, when that record goes into a wallet or something like that, it's a micro-credential. So it's stored as a micro-credential because you've signed it, and you can have a notary sign it on your behalf. And then when you pass it around, it's as a consent receipt token, specific to a purpose. And that's how we imagine trustworthy ID working. This right here is about differential transparency. So I'm happy to announce this new thing. It was funded by the NGI, European funding for this research. But effectively, you have your own record of receipt, so the expected state of transparency. And when you see see the service again, if it's the same, because it's being monitored independently, then it would be green. And at a glance, you know you're dealing with the same privacy state or security state. If it's yellow or red, that means there's a notice or notification that's waiting. And when you read that notification, you get a record, which is a proof of notice record. So you can use a proof of notice record instead of clicking a tick box to agree to terms and services. So that's the replacement. And I'm totally out of time. So this is about how to exchange stuff without ever giving people your personal data. So zero public network means your data is never exposed without a controller being identified. So every processing activity is through an identified controller who has a role as maybe a processor or a joint controller or a sub-processor like Google. And so yes, zero public network for the consent economy. And that's it, yeah. Thanks.
There's a lot to unpack in there. We have a few questions here. I'm not quite sure how to prioritize these. This one actually online has a Canadian flag symbol. I can't see it on there. I think one of the interesting questions further back was about when somebody changes their consent, so typically to revoke because somebody changed something in what they're doing with your data, that has a whole bunch of downstream consequences, right? And I mean, when you looked at, sorry, I'm interpreting the question, but one of the things here is there's a whole bunch of people learning models of the population, and you now have to unlearn, and that causes pain for the companies that are building, market research. Yeah. So I think that's one of the. But there's very little literature on unlearning.
These are the companies that can't find your personal data, and they're we don't know where your data is. We just processed it, and we have it. We're making all this money off of it. Oh, but we know our ads per second that we can show to you, So it's really for those types of security issues and privacy issues. For people, I think privacy online is security against surveillance, really, right? So that's a critical sort of aspect, the human side.
Right. This is something specific which you can probably answer about. In courts, interpreted data protection across systems, what precedents have been most authoritative in that specifically?
Well, so the Council of Europe 108 Plus is this international enforceable privacy regulation that's being ratified for 2023 with over 20, I think there's 50 plus countries that will be enjoying this framework. So I think that's authoritative internationally. So that's what we use as a baseline with the GDPR to assess all the other privacy notice regulations against. So what we like to do is we have 3 transparency performance indicators. One of them is that's in the operational privacy standard. I think there was the last slide that, so there is an operational privacy standard. It introduces 3 transparency performance indicators, and I'll save that for break or something.
Okay, we should wrap up. We have a 10-minute break now, but let's thank all the 3 speakers, and that was really great. Thanks so much.
Thanks.